Good evening. My name is Alan Williams, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's edition of our Canadian Institute for Historical Education continuing series of lectures. Tonight we're very happy to have J.D.M. James Stewart talking about his newly published book, The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. Before introducing James, though, I'd like to welcome those who are watching online as well. And with the Jays playing in an hour or so, I think many of you chose to watch online rather than be present in the room. But we have a good crowd here, nevertheless. So thank you for being here, and thank you for those who are watching online. I do have a few opening announcements. We have several other lectures planned for the next few months, but I'll start with what our vision statement is, and that is promoting historical literacy through research, education, and engagement in the public square. And we have two more lectures coming up, one at the end of November. On Tuesday, November 25th, we have author Stephen Bone, and he's going to be in conversation with Christopher Dummett, who's a professor of Canadian history at Trent University, on the subject of Manifest Destiny. And as you may know, Stephen Bone's two books, Company and Dominion, both deal with the Canadian West. And so the subtitle is How the HBC, the CPR, and Sir John A. helped to build a Canadian nation against the odds. And then in January, we have John Ibbotson, well-known Canadian author, talking about his book from 2023 called The Duel. And that is Diefenbaker, Pearson, and the Making of Modern Canada. So you can read more about those events on the CIHE website, which is cihe.ca. And we do have a couple of additional ones that are not formally, well, the next one, I guess, is it's not formally a CIHE event, but we're happy to promote Jerry Amernick, who is in the audience in the front row here. He's publishing a book in a week or two, early November, I guess, called Sleepwalking. And that is going to be right in this room on Wednesday, November 12th. You can come back and get a copy of Jerry's book and hear about that. And also we have in February, we are hosting a play written about Egerton Ryerson. And it's called The Trial of Egerton Ryerson, I should say. The Trial of Egerton Ryerson, and that's going to be down at the Arts and Letters Club, which is down near Yonge and Dundas. So that's our program for the coming season. And I also have a book to give away. So I should say, first of all, that this is the book, The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. And copies are available at the back from Timo of Sutherland House. And I believe they are with tax $39.85. But one lucky person will get a copy of this. So I'm going to ask James to draw a number. And just so you understand how we do this, the first row, the chairs are essentially numbered. We have 60 chairs set out. And the front row is 1 to 18, the second row is 19 to 38, and then the last row is 39 to 60.
Hopefully I pick 1 or 6.
58. So it's in the back row, right here. I got to get the book. Sir, that is for you. Okay, so what we're going to do tonight, James is going to offer a few remarks about the book, maybe for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we're going to have another conversation for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we will have audience questions. So the first thing is I will introduce James, who is well known to many of you, I think, but he is a writer, an historian, and one of Canada's foremost experts on the Prime Ministers. His commentary regularly appears in the Globe and Mail, the Hub, and the Literary Review of Canada. And his previous book, being Prime Minister, was a Hill Times Top 100 pick. He has also inspired a generation of students over a 30-year teaching career, teaching high school history in Toronto, Montreal, and Panama City. And he lives here in Toronto. So please welcome J.D.M. Stewart.
Thank you, Alan, for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay with the microphone? No. Oh, no? I don't think it's on. I have turned it on. Who's our technology guy? Oh, anyway, can you hear me even if I don't have the microphone on? No? No, it is on. It's right here. Should be here like this. Yeah. I don't know what's going on here. Do you want to give me your microphone, Alan, until this gets fixed? Okay. Hopefully we don't get a big, well, if we do. Okay. Who invited you? Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for coming out on a Tuesday when you're really tired from last night, in all likelihood, watching the Blue Jays play. I'm a little tired, just a few hours of sleep. But it is great to be among people who are civically minded and would like to learn a little bit about Canadian history and hear about this new book on Canadian Prime Ministers. And it's also great to be here with some of my former colleagues and former students. Are we good? Okay. I was at a book event in Halifax, and two of my former students showed up there as well. So wherever I'm going, when you teach for 30 years and you end up teaching a few thousand kids, sometimes they'll show up to your book events, which is really great to see. Before we begin, this is an unusual way to begin a book talk, but some of you may know about the passing of Tim Cook, the great Canadian historian who died on the weekend. And I want to say a few words about him. And if you've seen the book on the back, you'll see that Tim provided a blurb for my book. And he was one of the country's greatest living historians. And the loss of his scholarship really blows a big hole in Canadian history, Canadian letters. He was the author of 19 books. He wrote about military history, which is not always an area that new historians are going into. Tim was only 54 years old, and while he was a friend of mine, and I wouldn't say that he was a close intimate of mine, but he was a friend. And you may be familiar with his books on the First World War, 2 volumes, the Second World War, 2 volumes, a book on the anniversary of Vimy Ridge. Are we going? Okay, so we're having a little... Okay. Is this one? Okay. Okay. So his book on the anniversary of Vimy Ridge in 2017, I would give excerpts from his books to my students. And so they were very familiar with him, and towards the end of the year they might say, oh, is this another reading from Tim Cook? Yes, it is. So he and I shared a lot of correspondence over the years, and on the 20 or so school trips that I did to the Canadian War Museum, I would often look him up to see if he was there. Could we have a quick meeting? Usually he wasn't there, maybe working from home. Maybe he would have been off fighting cancer, which he did twice in his life. He beat cancer twice before he passed away. But we did share a beer together in the summer of 2024. And he actually helped me with my chapter on Robert Borden. And I want to give you an example of what he did. And I'm going to read a little bit from my Borden chapter as part of tonight's activities. But in the original Borden chapter, I started it where Borden narrowly escaped the parliamentary fire of 1916. There's quite a detailed account of it in Robert Borden's memoirs. So I thought this would be a great way to start the chapter. Borden narrowly escaping the fire. He almost died, but he made it out. So after the beer together with Tim, he said he would read my Borden chapter, and I sent it to him, and he wrote back to me, and he said, "The opening vignette on the fire does not work. I know. Authors always appreciate frank feedback. It's how you make the book better. He said, "What does it do for the reader? Perhaps you can tie it to the war and the country on fire, but that is a stretch. I would cut it and use a story about Borden visiting the wounded in hospital. That is a gut-wrenching event he faced bravely and traumatically." So that is how my chapter on Borden begins, and I'm going to read the opening in Tim Cook's honor. On July 16, 1915, Prime Minister Robert Borden walked up the hospital at Cliveden in Buckinghamshire, England. This was the country estate of the American-born English politician Waldorf Astor. The scion of the famous family had made part of the estate grounds available to the Canadian Red Cross for the purpose of building a small hospital to care for convalescing soldiers. The Duchess of Connaught Canadian Red Cross Hospital was the result. Borden had arrived in England a week earlier, disembarking from the Adriatic in Liverpool after an Atlantic crossing that was potentially dangerous because of lurking German submarines. He had every intention of seeing as many wounded soldiers as possible during this first visit overseas since the Great War had begun in 1914. 3 days before arriving at Cliveden, he had had an audience with King George V, who praised the bravery of Canadian troops at the Second Battle of Ypres, Belgium, that spring, where over 2,000 Canadians had died. Borden noted to himself that the king seemed nervous and worried. There were around 100 such hospitals in Great Britain and France, so the Prime Minister's hope of seeing most of them gave way to the strategy of visiting those where there were the greatest concentrations of Canadian soldiers. But what Robert Borden was about to see, no one could have prepared him for. The wounded were suffering from all manner of disfigurement: ghastly gunshot wounds, bodies punctured by shrapnel, missing limbs from amputations, and scarred lungs from chlorine gas attacks. "I was inspired by the astonishing courage with which my fellow countrymen bore their sufferings," he wrote later of his hospital visits, "inspired also by the warmth of their reception, by the smile of welcome, by the attempt to rise in their beds to greet me." The Prime Minister sat at the bedsides of the soldiers he visited. He listened intently to their stories. Where there were a number recovering well enough to gather as a group, he addressed them, and the men responded enthusiastically to his remarks. At Cliveden, he was accompanied by Lady Nancy Astor, who Borden said had a magic influence upon the men. "Her presence in any of the wards is like a ray of sunshine," he wrote, noting that the huge psychological lift she gave to everyone. For Borden, this whole experience was arduous. "In many cases, it was difficult to restrain my tears when I knew that some poor boy, brave to the very last, could not recover. He was emotional, he was exhausted, and he would lose sleep over Canadian war casualties in the months and years that followed. The memory of those visits has never faded and will endure as long as my life," he wrote. So it's worth spending a bit of time on Borden, not just because of the influence of Tim Cook on the manuscript that I wrote, but also because the Borden chapter illustrates what I'm trying to do in the book, which is capture the essence of these prime ministers, but also look at their legacy and their influence or lack thereof, and whether they are remembered or not. And so, Tim Cook wrote a book on Canada's wartime leaders, Mackenzie King and Robert Borden. It's called Warlords. And with Remembrance Day in just a couple of weeks, I thought I'd spend a bit more time on Borden as part of my talk today. So I want to go to the conclusion of my book on Borden, because it does get to that post-Borden, after his life, how he's been remembered or not remembered. And I remember when I would teach about prime ministers in my teaching days, there's this great quote from a book by Jack Granatstein and Graham Rollison, came out in 1999, and it's called The Canadian 100. And it's a book that purports to be about the 100 most significant Canadians. And they begin their 1997 book It contains an entry for Robert Borden that says, "Perhaps one Canadian in 1,000 could properly identify Sir Robert Borden today." It might be true, maybe not in this audience, but you can imagine walking down Yonge Street and asking passersby, "Robert Borden, do you know who it is?" "Well, I'd like to see him because he's on the $100 bill, but I haven't seen one in a while." They were almost certainly right. 15 years later, in Warlords, Borden, Mackenzie King, and Canada's World Wars, the Canadian War Museum historian Tim Cook wrote that Borden has never been properly recognized for leading the country through one of its most difficult moments. Even at the unveiling of Borden's statue on Parliament Hill in 1957, the CBC described the crowd attending the event as small, presaging the obscurity the wartime leader would later face. The events of Sir Robert's stewardship as head of the government in some of the stormiest years has been apparently ignored by the present generation, the CBC report began. And then I write in here, plus ça change. Borden's relative anonymity among average Canadians is not unique. The same could be said for many of our former prime ministers. But perhaps it is most unkind in Borden's case, given that he led the country through the Great War and achieved lasting contributions. He made difficult choices, some of them ethically wanting, but he also revealed his humanity during the First World War, personally visiting soldiers whose terrible circumstances he took seriously. It would have been preferable for Borden to make greater efforts to understand Quebec. Tim Cook noted that Borden, quote, "may have left a poisoned chalice for his successors and perhaps the nation, but his goal has always been wartime victory." Robert Borden's legacy is not completely forgotten. In 2002, former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney wrote in the Globe and Mail that, quote, "in any ranking of Canadian Prime Ministers, there is Sir John A. Macdonald and there are the others." But, all right, so a little Mulroney sidebar here, because as you know, if you know from the secret Mulroney tapes, which is Peter C. Newman's collection of interviews with Brian Mulroney. Mulroney likes to talk about how there's Sir John A. Macdonald, and then there's me, Brian Mulroney, because there was only two prime ministers to win back-to-back, two Conservative prime ministers to win back-to-back majorities. Sir John A. Macdonald did it, and Brian Mulroney was the only other still to this day. But Robert Borden is among the great ones, noted Mulroney, not only because of his resolute wartime leadership, but his continuous and persistent assertion of Canadian sovereignty. And then, lastly, I quote political journalist Paul Wells. Some of you may remember him when he wrote for Maclean's Magazine, Toronto Star, etc. Now he has a quite popular Substack, which I would recommend to anyone. Political journalist Paul Wells weighed in on Borden in 2009. "I don't know about you," he wrote, "but I'd sure like to read more about Sir Robert Borden. Now there was a prime minister." After rhyming off numerous accomplishments, including some not mentioned in this book, rural mail delivery, income tax, the National Research Council, Wells opined that there is still a great big book to be written about Borden. Robert Craig Brown's 2-volume biography of the country's 8th prime minister remains the definitive work. It is a superb piece of scholarship, though Volume 2 was published in 1980, nearly 5 decades ago. So it's interesting when we look at our histories, our biographies of the prime ministers, they were all written 40, 50, 60 years ago in many cases. Pierre Trudeau and Lester B. Pearson, Diefenbaker, they're lucky to have more recent ones. So this idea of the forgotten prime ministers gets to part of why I wrote this book. And in my introduction, I talk about being at a Model United Nations event a couple of years ago with high school students where I was brought in to be the guest speaker. And I had on my screen in front of me a picture of Lester B. Pearson, and it was even labeled, it said Lester B. Pearson. And I said to the students, "Who do we have here in front of us? Model United Nations smart kids?" And there were crickets. Nobody knew. None of those kids knew that this was a former Prime Minister of Canada from 1963 to 1968, a Nobel Prize laureate for the Nobel Peace Prize, a Prime Minister who made a significant contribution to the country, both as a diplomat and as a Prime Minister. And so I thought I need to address this outside of the classroom, because the classroom is the great place to have an impact. And thankfully, I had that impact for 30 years. But it was time to bring it to a wider audience and encourage more Canadians to learn about our leaders. The journalist Peter C. Newman, who I mentioned earlier, he said in another of his books that every hour in the office of the Prime Minister is an hour in the history of the country. And he is a person selected by the people to lead the national direction. So of course we should know about the history, the decisions, and the consequences of those decisions. They influence us everywhere. And if we just think about taxation policy, foreign policy, how did we get Medicare? How did we get the Canadian flag that we have? What about truth and reconciliation, environmental policy? All of these things run through the office of the Prime Minister, and we forget those moments and those consequences of those decisions at our peril. There was, I quote Michael Bliss in his book, 1994. It's called Right Honorable Men. Many of you here may have it in your own bookshelf. And he says, is my book history from the top down about the great leaders of Canada? Because even in the 1990s, there was pushback against political history and pushback against history that focused on what are inevitably, in the case of prime ministers, white men. And his answer to that was, yes, it is. And I'm not apologizing for it. And I'm trying to pick up in the same manner as Professor Bliss and say that, the leadership that we need to study is the people who led the country. And we have had one woman prime minister, and I think Alan and I might talk about that a little bit later on. But I think those are the reasons that I wrote the book. And I may be preaching to the converted a little bit here, because you've taken time out of your precious day to come and listen to a talk about prime ministers. Some of you, it's a family obligation. Some of you, you're close friends of mine, and I appreciate all of that. But for those of you who I don't even know on a personal basis, it's great that you're here. But I think all of us need to promote and talk up some of these things with our friends who maybe aren't paying as much attention. And whether it's young people, if you have young nieces and nephews, or you might have grandchildren, and let's spark up a conversation about the importance of leadership and Canadian history. So I'm going to turn it over to Alan now so that we can have a little bit of a discussion about the book. I was going to read from my epilogue, but you can read about that on the weekend if you pick up a copy of the book. So let's have a little chat, Alan.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks for your opening remarks.
Thank you.
And thank you for saying a few words about Tim Cook. It's a big loss. And I just want to let people know that there is a tribute that will be published on our website tomorrow by our friend Eric McGeer, who's watching online. And you can read a little more about Tim Cook. And of course, there's been stuff in the National Post as well, including an article by Christopher Dummett today.
Yep, I read that this morning.
All right. Well, so thank you for that opening. I wanted to start by just looking at the cover of the book. We've had 24 prime ministers, with Mark Carney being the 24th, and 8 of them are, go ahead.
I was just going to put it up like that, yeah.
8 of them are pictured on your cover, so I wondered if you can tell us how you made those choices of who makes the cover.
Well, I chose my 8 favorites, and I put them on there. I get that question a lot about the cover. It is a beautiful cover, designed by a woman named Lena Yang, so a shout out to her. Book selling is part art and part commerce, so you have to have a cover that you think will appeal to people. And this was an interesting process to go through in choosing the lucky 8 prime ministers to be on the cover of the book. And you'll note that, well, first of all, Mark Carney is on there because he is the current prime minister. And the publisher was adamant that, to show the currency of the book, because there is a short chapter on Mark Carney, that we'll put Mark Carney on the cover. I said that I wanted to make sure Pierre Trudeau was on the cover of the book, because Pierre Trudeau has quite a bit of currency and identifiability among the book buying class, people such as you. You probably all have a Pierre Trudeau story. Some of you probably even met him. And then, and across the top is the, four of the big names from Canadian history: John A. Macdonald, Wilfrid Laurier, Robert Borden, who I spoke about today, and then Mackenzie King. So it was a little bit of happenstance. On the bottom, I've got 2 conservatives and 2 liberals. I didn't want to be accused of any kind of political favoritism. I myself am a nonpartisan anyway. And so I've got a good selection, because even across the top, 2 conservatives and 2 liberals. So it would actually be, I would say, if I were still teaching, I probably would have asked my students to select the cover. I would have put them in groups of 4 and said, I need you to choose 8 prime ministers to be on the cover. This will be a great learning task. You have to give me reasons why. And we might have ended up with slightly different ones. But that's how I came to these 8 people. All
right. And so Saturday was October 25th, and that is the anniversary of the election in 1993, when there was a big change in Canadian politics. The Conservatives that had been elected with Brian Mulroney, but were now with Kim Campbell, went down to a massive defeat. So do you want to talk a little bit about maybe Kim Campbell or about the election in 93? Or?
Sure. I'm glad that you raised Kim Campbell for a variety of reasons. One, I spent 2+ decades teaching at BSS, where I taught Canadian history, and it's an all-girls school, and certainly we like to promote women in leadership. And Kim Campbell was a short-serving prime minister. She served for about 4 months. And there are a number of short-term prime ministers in Canadian history. There were 4 that served over 5 years after Sir John A. Macdonald died. There was John Turner, Joe Clark. So those short-term prime ministers, I actually collapsed them into shorter chapters together. So the 4 after John A., they're all in one chapter together. Joe Clark, John Turner, they're in a single chapter together. Kim Campbell, I gave her her own chapter. And that was my deliberate, I guess it's an implicit message that I think it's kind of important that we pay attention to the fact that we have had one woman serve as prime minister. And while it was short, it's still an important part of Canadian prime ministerial history and Canadian history in general. So that's why she's got a chapter of her own. And she's quite proud of being the first woman prime minister. I remember I interviewed her for my first book, and I was trying to be respectful of her time. And I wrapped up the conversation. I said, "Oh, thank you so much for your time." And she said, "Hold on a second. You teach at an all-girls school, don't you?" I said, "Yes, I teach at BSS." And she said, "Well, I think it's really important that they understand about the nature of, that we've had a female prime minister, and she said, it's not just for the girls to be able to look up and see on the wall that we have had a woman who's been prime minister. Because don't underestimate the fact of kids looking at books, looking at pictures, and seeing if they can see themselves in those photos. And so she said it's important for that to be able to happen. And she said not only for the girls, but also for the boys to see that that is something that happens in Canadian history too.
Well, it's unfortunate for her sake that longevity is often considered a mark of a great prime ministership, and I guess that's just reality. The shorter ones didn't have time to engage with big issues. But maybe that leads to the question, what is it that makes a great prime minister?
Yeah, I should have like the perfect answer set for that, because I get it fairly regularly. But I think there's a number of things. When I was asked this question in Halifax, the questioner said, what is the single most important quality? And I said humility was a pretty important quality for a prime minister to have. It might seem counterintuitive, but I think that if you have a certain sense of humility, then you can work in a team. If you have humility, you'll be able to see if you've made mistakes and correct them. If you have humility, you can laugh at yourself. And I think that's an important quality. Peter C. Newman, I know I've mentioned his name 3 times, but he's one of our great chroniclers. He talked about a great prime minister has the ability to be an ideological acrobat, to square any circle. Because in a country like Canada, which is very diverse and regional, lots of competing interests, it's a challenge to govern the country. And you need to be able sometimes to put water in your wine in order to be successful. And I think the most successful prime ministers, whether it was Laurier or Louis Saint Laurent, Mackenzie King, they have been able to massage and trim their sails when needed, and that's essential.
Well, just as you were saying that, I'm going through the list, and I'm trying to think in my mind which prime minister would be considered someone who was most known for humility. And I have someone in mind, but I'm wondering if you do.
See, that's the problem, is the follow-up question is, well, who are you thinking of when you think of humility? Because most of them, let's face it, they're not. Because
they're not,
you have to have a healthy ego. And I know that Louis Saint Laurent's granddaughter is in the audience, and that is the name that first comes to mind for me when I think of a prime minister that has humility.
Well, I was going to say that was the one I was thinking of as well.
Yeah. And he was a gentleman and someone who was, well, I'll give you an anecdote. Speaking of humility, when he first became prime minister, he left the prime minister's office and he walked over to the elevator to leave the parliament buildings. And the elevator operator was standing there. And Louis Saint Laurent says, well, what are you still doing here? And he said, well, I leave when the prime minister does. And the prime minister said, well, from now on, you go home with the others. I can get myself down the elevator quite well by myself. And so that is the act of someone who has some humility.
Very good. And welcome to Louis Saint Laurent's granddaughter. That's great to have you with us. Okay, so we're sitting about 200 meters or so from Mount Pleasant Cemetery. And I know there are 2 Canadian prime ministers buried there. And does anyone know which 2 we're talking about? John Turner and Mackenzie King. That's right.
Right, yeah.
So I wonder if you could talk a bit about the relationship between prime ministers and Toronto. The rest of the country tends to look at Toronto maybe with a certain jaundiced view.
Yeah.
So what about, how does that fit into the prime minister's idea?
Yeah, there's a surprising amount of prime ministerial history that runs through Toronto, even though it hasn't really for a while. It depends how you want to add it all up, because Stephen Harper grew up in Etobicoke, I think it was.
Leaside as well.
Yeah, Leaside, right. Richview Collegiate, I think he went to. So he is from Toronto, but he didn't represent a Toronto riding. Of course, Mackenzie King went to the University of Toronto and has a strong Toronto history through there, but he didn't represent a Toronto riding either, but he is buried here. And John Turner, as you mentioned, again, didn't represent Toronto ridings, but lived in Toronto before he became prime minister and then after he was prime minister. Lester B. Pearson was a U of T graduate as well, and so there's some Toronto history that runs through here with our prime ministers, but not maybe to the same degree that say Montreal does, or Halifax actually is home to 3 prime ministers, believe it or not. But Toronto has a little bit going for it. In terms of King and Pearson, Harper to some degree, Turner to some degree, and I'm sure a lot of you have walked by the Mackenzie King gravesite in Mount Pleasant Cemetery, which it's a beautiful plinth that's in the ground, and it was actually defaced about 4 or 5 years ago, and they had to do some restoration to it.
Okay, and to what extent is looking at Canadian history through the prime ministers a good entry point to learn about the history of the country in general?
Yeah, I think there are many ways to get into Canadian history. Politics and politicians is one way. Of course, there's sports as an avenue. There is, urban history, environmental history. I used to say to my students, if we were doing an open-ended topic, I would say, choose what you really like and then investigate the history of it. So that's what I would encourage. I'm sure many of you do that already. You may be interested in fashion, and so you read about fashion history. I happen to think prime ministers are a very appropriate way, because you will learn about some of the big big tranches of history, some of the big decisions of history, and then you can always drill down later. So for example, if you were to be reading my book, you will get sort of the greatest hits of Canadian history, because you will read about decisions made in terms of First World War, Second World War, decisions made in terms of Quebec and its place in Confederation, decisions, interestingly, about Canadian Indigenous policy. And so we haven't paid a lot of attention to that in most of Canadian history, but in the last decade or so, we've picked that up. But no book on all the prime ministers has looked at the Indigenous file in terms of the decisions made by prime ministers. And there's something in every chapter on that. You might at first blush think, oh, I'm a bit surprised to hear that. But it's actually, I think people used to think, well, those files never crossed the prime minister's desk. Well, in fact, they did. And same with environmental history, too. So when you look at, when your entry point is at the level of the people who make the decisions, you're going to end up looking at some pretty momentous decisions in the life of a country.
Okay. And you mentioned Michael Bliss's book, which was, I guess, 1994, I think, and another by Jack Granatstein and Norman Hilmer, which was maybe a little bit more recently. And there was one, I guess, in the 60s by Bruce Hutchinson as well, that were collective biographies of the prime ministers. So aside from the fact that there's been another 4 since the last series of books, why did you think it was time for a book about the prime ministers, and how is yours different from the previous ones?
So the first thing I'll tell you about that is this book is published by Sutherland House, and the owner of the publishing company is a gentleman by the name of Ken White, who has done quite a bit in terms of promoting Canadian history through his publishing company. And so I give him an immense amount of credit for publishing this book, as well as the other books that he has seen through to completion. And I was talking about this book with him a few weeks ago, and I said, yeah, there's the Bruce Hutchinson's book, and then there's the Michael Bliss book from '94, and this one from... He says, stop talking about those books. This is the book on prime ministers now. This is the one people need to read. The other ones are 25 and 30 years old. This is now the book on Canadian prime ministers. And so I thought, okay, I appreciate the vote of confidence, Ken. And which reminded me that when he first decided to sign me up to write this book, he said, what titles have you thought of for this book? I said, I don't know, I was thinking Prime Ministers and Our Times or something like this. He said, I think we're just going to call it The Prime Ministers. We're going to own the marketplace on this, and just this is the book, and so that will be the title, The Prime Ministers. And so that is the title. So why is it important, despite the other 3 or 4 books that have been written in the previous 60 years or so? Well, history evolves and changes over time, as you know. History is debated. Other issues come to the fore. We have new interpretations of our leaders. And so things that were written in 1994, that's a different time in Canadian history. That's 30 years ago now. And as you know, imagine if you were in 1934, well, the previous book was 1964, and every generation tells its stories in a slightly different manner. And new evidence comes to life, new issues come to life, and that's why, as you know, I mentioned earlier about the Indigenous file, the environmental file. These are causes that Canadians care about today. So, well, let's take a look and see what we find under the rocks in terms of prime ministers and those topics. The other things that we've cared about for a long time are in the book as well. And so I think, in the United States, there's books that come out about the presidents all the time. We don't do that enough in Canada. I suppose I'm happy that there aren't a lot of other books on prime ministers right now, because this will be the one people want to pick up. And so I just, it's clearly time. And then when I've always been a passionate advocate for telling our stories, and not just to my students, but to the whole country. That's why I'm a writer as well. And I think it's important that these kinds of stories are well understood. And as you know, with the threats to Canadian sovereignty from the United States, which would be quite unexpected, although I'll tell you that Laurier had some pretty interesting encounters with Theodore Roosevelt that were not too dissimilar from what's happening today. But when you have a threat to your sovereignty and you look inside and you say, well, what is Canadian sovereignty anyway? What are our stories? What kind of history have we had? Well, this is a moment now to try to look back and go, okay, this is where we've come from, and that's why I think this book is really important.
Well, that's great. Well, so this is the book about Canadian prime ministers now.
It's the one, yeah.
So I think we should try to find a way to make sure that this book gets in every high school library and gets into the hands of every high school kid that we know especially. And
Well, yeah, can I just pick up on that for a second? Because Manulife Insurance Company was the first CEO of the company was Alexander Mackenzie, the second prime minister. And so I wrote to Manulife probably two weeks ago, and I didn't know who to send it to exactly, so I sent an email to the director of communications at Manulife, and I said, hey, I think I've got a philanthropic idea for you here. It wouldn't cost a lot of money. Let's say, I don't know how many high schools there are in Canada, but let's say there's 2,000 or so, could be 3,000, I don't know. It wouldn't cost a lot of money for a corporation or even a benevolent individual to say, I'm going to buy a copy of this book so that it's in every high school in Canada, because it should be. And high schools don't have a lot of money to be going out and buying hardcover books and putting them in there, but there is an opportunity for corporations or persons to say, look, I believe in this project. And anyway, so I emailed Manulife with the little connection. One of your CEOs was a former prime minister, but I haven't heard back from them yet. And so I've emailed them a second time now too, because I don't give up. So my next email is going to the CEO.
well, maybe there's someone here that can help us move this project forward. So before we go to audience questions, I've got one more. You can answer this in any way that you like, but just a lob ball question to you. Who is your favorite prime minister?
I know. All the people who've known me for 30 years are like, oh, how's he going to answer this one? So, you know, I really like all the prime ministers, I have to say. That's how I start my answer. So I have respect for the office, and I can find something good to say about each of our prime ministers. I can find a criticism for each of our prime ministers as well. But if you're going to push me to make a decision, I will land on Wilfrid Laurier. And I land on Laurier because when I was a young man, I was a student at McGill, where Laurier was a student. I had to write an essay about Wilfrid Laurier, about his nationalism compared to the nationalism of Henri Bourassa. And I just got taken in by his eloquence, his desire to be a conciliator among the various factions in Canadian history, his tolerance for other points of view, and his passion for Canada. I've often quoted Laurier, who said, Canada has been the inspiration of my life. And that's how I've lived my life, even before I knew Laurier said it. So when I read about Laurier and his passion for Canada, I just was immediately drawn to it. And, you know, he's probably our greatest orator. But remember when I said earlier about the challenges of trying to govern a country that is very diverse and regional, if you have the disposition of a Laurier, where you seek to unite as opposed to divide, where you're willing to compromise in order to move forward, then the country's going to be in good hands. And so prime ministers who follow the Laurier template are going to be the most successful ones.
My grandfather was born during the 1900 election, and his middle name that his parents gave him was Laurier. So I can tell you that his
Very
parents
envious.
thought highly of Laurier also. Okay, so we've got time for some audience questions. I will walk around with the mic, and please, we've got a question right off the bat from Don Cranston.
Thank you, Alan. James, I still have the 1972 Bob Stanfield election poster in my house. So I'm sort of preempting the question, but who was the greatest prime minister Canada never had?
Right, and so it's a good question, and a couple of names come to mind. Stanfield, I think, is an obvious choice for a lot of people, but I'm going to put two names out there of a more recent vintage. Bob Rae would be one, and Jean Charest would be my other choice. Both of them went for the top job, but ultimately didn't get it. And those two gentlemen, I think, also fit that Laurier mold of being consensus seekers, inspired by Canada, and Bob Rae was also a great orator. Well, so is Jean Charest. They're two tremendous orators. And I remember being in the House of Commons once, and Bob Rae stood up to ask a question. And as you know, if you've watched a lot of parliamentary debates, not a lot of MPs speak without notes anymore. But Bob Rae could do anything without a note, and so could Jean Charest. So they're great orators, but also a great understanding of the country as well, I think. So those would be my two additions to yours of Bob Stanfield.
All right, thank you.
I wanted to ask you about Sir John A. Macdonald because, of course, as our first Prime Minister and for so long, he was an icon forever, and then all of a sudden, with all the Indigenous stuff, all of a sudden he was pitched aside in public opinion. I wanted you to reflect on how you balance all the different currents of public opinion that come in, up and down for prime ministers.
So I like that you use the word balance, because I've tried to achieve a balanced look at our prime ministers, and I do address the Macdonald reputation issue in the book. And so I think that it's an instructive, there was a very difficult period that the country went through in 2020, 2021, where statues were being torn down of Canadian figures such as Sir John A. Macdonald. And I would say that I don't think that there was a deep understanding of either the nature of history, which is very complex. It's never black and white. It's often multimodal and challenging to understand, and that two things can be true at the same time. But in this polarized world where we kind of want to make things into black or white. But unfortunately, that's not how the world works. It's not how history works. It's not how you yourself are constructed as a person or your family. And so for John A. Macdonald, I think he got caught up in this vortex of emotion that was not backed up by historical thinking. And so he was rightly criticized. I think one of the benefits that came out of that is it did force Canadians to ask some questions and look differently at their history. And I think we've done that. But now I think we've also figured out that there's two sides to this. There's another dimension, and that Sir John A. Macdonald made mistakes, as every prime minister has, and as every person in this room has. But that also there's a side of Sir John A. Macdonald that was essential to the development of the Dominion of Canada.
Okay, other questions from the audience? We've got one at the back from Patrick.
Hi, James. I know you're a historian, but I was wondering if you could comment on the future of historical education in Canada as you see it.
I was a little bit more bullish on it when I was a teacher. And so, I guess I'm a bit pessimistic, I would say. And the reason I'm a bit pessimistic is because I think a lot of the teachers who have seen the nation-building enterprise of history, the historical thinking side of history, I think that, they're almost through the system. And I'm not so sure that the teachers coming up out of teacher colleges now, I'm speculating a little bit. Some of my evidence is anecdotal, and so I can't say that this is true. I'm speculating a little bit. You asked a question about history. I'm not sure that the generation of teachers that's coming behind is as dialed into the importance of Canadian history as it seemed to be for people who were educated and grew up in the 1970s and 80s. Because remember, if you grew up in the 70s or 80s, you still have the tailwinds of the 1960s behind you. The people who were around during Expo 67, the Centennial of Canada, the great cultural development of arts and letters in this country. You had those tailwinds still with you. But if you're growing up in the 90s, I'm not sure if you have the same historical and cultural center about the importance of culture and history. And in my book, in my conclusion, I quote from the Massey Commission, 1951, established by Louis Saint Laurent. And in the Massey Commission of 1951, they said, it is so important that every Canadian understands the history and culture of the nation. And it was as true in 1951 as it is in 2025. And so I really hope that the teachers who are responsible for educating our young people can really take that to heart and understand that there's a lot to learn in a Canadian history class. There is a lot to do. It's a very important job, and I hope all of those teachers will take it as seriously as I did and my colleagues who I taught with for 30 years.
All right, we've got time for 2 or 3 more questions. The next one is going to be from, we got 2 in the front row, great. Next one's going to be from Nick.
Congratulations on the book, James. I
Thank
just
you,
wondered
Nick.
if I could ask you about prime ministers and cabinet making. What was it like in the beginning? What is it like more recently? What changed and why?
Mm-hmm. So it's always been a challenge. And again, back to that regional diversity and linguistic, all the diversities that are part of Canada. There's always been these principles that prime ministers have had to adhere to. You know, you have to have a certain number of francophones. You need to have a certain number from Quebec. You used to always have to have a francophone from outside Quebec. I don't think they actually do that anymore, but that used to be something that had to happen, is a francophone from outside Quebec. I think there's less to choose from, less timber for a prime minister to choose from his cabinet, because I don't think we have the same big names from business and other parts of Canadian society seeking office. And that's a problem for the Canadian House of Commons in Parliament. So, you know, cabinets have become quite, what's the word? They become quite big, right? I think the current cabinet is around low 30s. It's been as high as 40 under Mulroney and maybe Justin Trudeau's final cabinet, I can't remember. So it's still what it's always been in terms of trying to capture those regions of the country. That's very important to have people at the cabinet table from the Maritimes and the various regions of Canada, but I don't think people pay as much attention to cabinet anymore either. You know, just ask your friends, name to me 3 cabinet ministers. Really hard pressed to do it. Maybe your friends can do it, but ask the friend of your friends. You don't see cabinet ministers taking the same role in government as they used to, because the center of power in government has really centralized around the prime minister. And not many prime ministers are offering cabinet ministers a chance to run their departments. The last prime minister to do that was Jean Chrétien. I bet you can still name some Jean Chrétien cabinet ministers even today, when it's been more than 20 years since he left office, because Chrétien allowed his ministers to do their job. Brian Mulroney allowed his ministers to do the job. You might even be able to name a Mulroney cabinet minister. So that's my short answer, or I guess my long answer on cabinet there. And by the way, there's a new book on cabinets, isn't there? It's Patrice Dutil has edited a book about prime ministers and their cabinets from, I think it's U of T Press, if it's not UBC Press, but if you really, Statecraft, yes. Yeah, that's the one.
All right, thank you. Question in the front row.
Well, the only question I had was about teaching history in Quebec and teaching it in the rest of Canada, and you know it's quite different in Quebec for the Quebecois. So how does that sort of somehow align in the whole?
Yeah, so I started my teaching career in Quebec, although I wasn't teaching Canadian history then, but I'm pretty familiar with what it's about there. It's actually 2 years of Canadian history you take when you are in CIHE in Quebec. So I guess my answer to that is every province, because education is a provincial jurisdiction, every province approaches history differently. There are only 4 or 5 provinces that mandate kids to have a high school credit in history. Thankfully, Ontario is one of them. Ontario's history curriculum is actually pretty good, so we're lucky, we're fortunate for that. But if you lived in Saskatchewan or Alberta, there is no dedicated history course. You're going to have a social science course, which will be an amalgam of some geography, some history, some civics, maybe a little bit of economics, but it won't be focused on Canadian history. So that's a problem. And in Quebec, everybody teaches history a little bit to tailor it to the regions where they live, and I think that's important. So Maritimes the Maritime provinces usually put a maritime bent on things, but Nova Scotia is the only province in the Maritimes that mandates a credit in history at the high school level. So depending on your provinces, depending on what kind of history your child is going to get.
All right, our next question is here at the back.
So, hello, James.
Hello, Jean.
My question has to do with electability. I noticed that amongst your favorite were large personalities. You've mentioned that Laurier was a wonderful orator, and some of the unelected prime ministers also were wonderful, vibrant personalities. I'm so interested in the difference between Brian Mulroney with huge personality, charisma, ego, and Stephen Harper or even Mackenzie King with much smaller doses of that kind of charisma or visibility or, I think I've said it.
Thank you.
This is Madame Renaud, who is Louis Saint Laurent's granddaughter. So it's thank you for asking the question. And so you picked really good examples in looking at Brian Mulroney, who had, I guess, what the kids call the Riz. He had a lot of charisma and a big personality, and I think that can be useful, very useful to being prime minister. But also, Mackenzie King and Stephen Harper, similar temperaments in terms of their, they have a bit of a bland nature in public. But don't be misled, because Stephen Harper actually behind the scenes was a pretty charming fellow who had a great sense of humor and would light up a room when he would do impersonations of John Diefenbaker and Jean Chrétien. So there is a private life to the prime ministers that's pretty significant too. So I guess it depends on the person. You can make it work. I think what voters want is authenticity. You have to have a certain amount of charisma to be successful in politics, because after all, you're trying to persuade people to your point of view. But there are different ways of doing it, and even Mackenzie King won more elections than anyone in Canadian history. Go figure. It is still kind of confounding Mackenzie King. He will confound us till the end of time, which is really a fascinating thing to look at. Someone who was as uncharismatic as Mackenzie King, but yet he kept winning elections, which is a good credit to him.
Is there any other question yes?
Thank you. I was always impressed with what Lester Pearson managed to achieve in not very long and with a minority government. And I just wondered if you'd care to comment about the minority government status that he was working with.
Can I first congratulate you on your letter to the editor in today's Globe and Mail? I think that was you. Well done. This is Lynn McDonald, who asked the question and has a letter in today's paper. So minority parliaments. We have a minority parliament right now, as you know, and it sort of doesn't seem like it, though, because there doesn't seem to be the threat that it's going to bring down the government. But I guess it's a test of political skills, as you would know, Lynn, and we seem to be having minority governments more often in the country as the number of political parties continues to divide the vote. I think it takes, there's pros and cons, because I think Canadians sometimes like minority government because it forces political parties to make compromises and listen to the people who were elected by the opposing party. But there are other times when you really need a majority government to take control of the steering wheel and get things done. And if a majority government comes through and you don't like what they did, then you can always vote them out in the next election. So there's pros and cons to both of them, and Pearson, as much as I'm confounded by what Mackenzie King did and how he got elected, I'm still kind of confounded about how Lester Pearson pulled off what he did in 5 years with pensions, Medicare, the flag, just to name three pretty huge things, and he did it in 5 years with a majority government. And actually, really he did it in 4 years because he announced his resignation in, December of 1967. So it was pretty remarkable.
Okay, we've got time for one more from Jerry.
Thank you. You mentioned Brian Mulroney. When I'm here with my wife, when Brian Mulroney was elected in 1984, our daughter was 3 years old, and I was trying to explain to her we have a new leader, Mr. Mulroney, and no matter how many times I explained it, it kept coming out as Mr. Macaroni. So, last question. Which of our prime ministers would you most like to share a beer with? And which one would you least like to share a beer with?
So I would love to have, well, I mean, how do you make me choose just one, right, to have a beer with? But sometimes it whittles down to Lester B. Pearson, just because I think he was a great storyteller, briefly a history professor, great sense of humor, lover of baseball. So you can imagine going to have a couple of beers with Lester B. Pearson right now and watch the baseball game. We'd call him Mike because that's what everybody called him. As you know, Mike Pearson was what he went by. So I'd love to have a drink with Mike Pearson. In terms of least, probably that's either Alexander Mackenzie, the second prime minister, 1874 to 1878, who was a teetotaler. But also, he was as charismatic as Sir John A. Macdonald was. Alexander Mackenzie was the anti-charismatic prime minister. And so I don't know that he would be the most interesting cat to have a beer with, but I'm sure we would find things to talk about since he was prime minister. And there's always things to talk about with anybody, really.
All right, that's a great way to end. I'm going to ask Joanne Archibald, who is a member of the Advisory Council of the Canadian Institute for Historical Education, to thank James.
Thanks, Alan. Hi, everyone. I am very fortunate to be a former student of Mr. Stewart's. I have graduated to calling him James, which is very exciting. But I wanted to thank James for his remarks today and the conversation with Alan. I think everyone learned a little something, and I would agree with Tim Cook that your entry into the Borden chapter is much stronger when you're talking about his engagement with soldiers in Britain, and that clearly shaped his trajectory for the rest of his prime ministership. So thank you for this incredible work. I look forward to getting my copy, and let me know how I can help you get it into every high school in Canada. Thanks, everyone.